In this first week's class, we will discuss the nature of data, various issues surrounding measurement scales associated with data, and how to summarize data using tables, graphs, and numbers, which are called summary statistics. The whole idea behind all of these techniques is to be able to reveal basic patterns that are there in the data. So looking at your syllabus, this is basically parts of chapter 2 and parts of chapter 3. Just be careful not to spend time reading sections that are not explicitly listed here. So the sections that are explicitly shown here are the ones that you should focus on. Okay, so before we get in, we'll get into the details in class, of course, but let me quickly give you an example of the kinds of things that we will be doing. So here is an example of, here is a very famous data set. This is a data set of 888, about 900 passengers of the Titanic. How many do we have? About 900 passengers. And for each passenger, we know whether they survived or not. 0 means they did not survive and 1 means they survived. The passenger class, so 1 was the highest class and 3rd was the lowest class of passenger. The name of the passenger, the gender, age, whether they had any brothers, sisters, or parents on board, and the fare that they paid in pounds. Okay, so you can see that all the data are not created equal. Some data is numeric, some is not. So the first part of the class will be we'll spend time on having a discussion about the different kinds of data and what are the various measurement scales associated with data. And then we will look at how to summarize data using tables and graphs. Of course, it doesn't do any good to give you all these 900 numbers, 900 observations and tell you go figure out what the patterns are. It's always helpful to summarize what we have. So one of the ways in which you summarize data is by using tables. So you can see an example of a table over here. So you have different classes of passengers, class 1, class 2, and class 3. Remember, class 1 was the highest class of customer, the most expensive tickets that they bought. And you can see that they survived. They had the highest survival rate, 62% survived, whereas the passengers in the lowest, with the lowest ticket class, they had the lowest survival rate. Also, only 24% of them survived. So this summary, this tabular summary, tells you something about the pattern in the data. Similarly, if you look at by gender, summarize the data by gender, then 74% of women survive, whereas only 18% of men survive. That tells you again something about a pattern in the data. So we'll look at different tabular methods that one can use to summarize data. These are called frequency distribution, relative frequency distribution tables. We can also summarize data using graphs. So here is one type of graph. This is a bar chart. You will see how to use those. So this is very informative. For example, you can see that among the people who survive, the kids, the really infants survived, whereas the teenagers didn't, had a very low rate of, they didn't survive all that much. Okay, so when you look at, so this is a graphical summary of the data that that's of the Titanic data, and there are other graphical methods that one can use. One can use pie charts and so forth. So you will see these techniques. Another method that we will see is how to use numbers instead of drawing pictures. Pictures take up real estate. So there are numerical methods one can use to summarize data. For example, if I go back to the data set, I can compute the average fare that was paid by passengers. On average, how much did they pay? So let's say, for example, I go to the end over here. I compute the average of H2 to H. So the average fare paid was 32 pounds. Now we can compare this to the average fare paid by those who did not survive, and we can compare that to the average fare paid by those who did survive and see whether those who paid more survived at a higher rate. So there are various ways you can summarize these data patterns using numbers, and these are what are called summary statistics. And we'll see various kinds of summary statistics that one can use. So this is basically the type of content that we will be covering in the first class. That is taking large data sets and summarizing them using pictures and numbers in a way that we can try and get a sense of basic patterns that are there in the data. Now, as we go through this first week's class, one thing I would like you to do, there are various tutorials, video tutorials on the mechanics of drawing these graphs and the mechanics of using Excel to compute these numbers, these summary statistics. Of course, you need to master those, but equally important, if not more so, as you go through these different techniques, try to form in your mind comparison. That is, when would you use one graphical method versus another? When would you use one tabular summary method versus another? What are the strengths of one approach to summarizing versus another? What does one summary statistic tell you that the other doesn't? So when would it be appropriate to use not just the mechanics of executing the tool, but also when is it appropriate to use one particular tool or the other? So keep that thought in mind as we go through this week's class. I think there are maybe 4 or 5 online videos also that I have prepared for the first class. As I mentioned in my introductory email, you're welcome to look at both those videos as well as the content in the book, but you don't have to do both, whatever works for you. All right, very well. That's a summary and the roadmap for the first week of class.